Up YouTube, Nick here. So today our guest is Varun. He's a fellow colleague of mine. And so in this podcast, there's actually two distinct um, kind of ideas that we talked about. And in part one of this series, we talk about Hinduism and we talk about potential, relations between Hinduism and Christianity and some differences. And then the second part of the series, which is this video here, is us talking about, um, you know, he's skeptical about can we actually unify science and religion. And so, he comes from that approach and I come from my approach, and it's a pretty stimulating conversation, but it becomes, almost somewhat technical, and we start talking about, interpretations of quantum mechanics and exciting things like that. So I decided to separate these videos, but, if the first part interests you, make sure to check out part one to the series as well, and I hope you enjoy.
I'm actually curious, and it seems like we're veering more towards like the meta religion like facet of our discussion now. So I think this
Sure.
might be a good time to ask this.
Sure, yeah.
So I also went through like my um, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, like militant atheist phase, where it was like, yeah, this is like literally the most repulsive idea in
Sure.
human history,
Yeah,
and
sure.
I'm just glad to be rid of it. It was definitely a big part of my life when I was like maybe 14, 15, just like watching these videos and like completely rewiring the way I looked at the world.
Sure.
Um, I think since then, I would still in many ways consider myself like either atheist or agnostic.
Hmm.
I'm like I call myself like a functional atheist in the sense that I'm definitely Hindu and like I like a lot of the cultural elements,
Hmm.
and I like the stories, and I think it's a nice way, or it gives you a nice lens to view the world through something that's like familiar. Um,
Sure.
but I don't know if I believe in God or even a higher power per se. So I'm curious how your like worldview or philosophy has evolved from that state of militant atheism to something that's now, as you described, as being overtly religious.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, at least my conception of what religion is, it it's actually impossible for anyone to be atheistic. And what I mean by this is like I think there's a few ways. I remember in my last podcast, me and Max were actually talking for a bit, and then he wanted to argue that we should make everything figurative about the religion, and then if it's all figurative, then it's easier to digest. And what I would say is, I took that approach first, and I said, like, okay, let me interpret everything metaphorically and figuratively and see if there's something that it's getting at. And then, Jordan Peterson definitely inspired me a lot with, my notion of God. But it's kind of like, you know, because you make actions in the world, you have a value hierarchy that's generating the actions that you take. And then in this value hierarchy, whatever's sitting at the top of it, effectively, and for all intents and purposes, is your God. And so you can imagine like a CEO of a company, like at the top of their value hierarchy is profit. Like it's like profit above all else. And it doesn't matter, you know, like who gets hurt, doesn't matter if we fire people, doesn't matter the effect it has on society. I just want to optimize profits. Right. And I'm not saying every CEO is this way, but at least you can conceptualize such a person. And what I would say then is, and this is where I have kind of more of a polytheistic view, is I would say that that person effectively is believes in the god of capitalism, like the capitalist god or something, and then by acting out those principles, he's worshiping that god. And so then this is the, you know, at least the idea of how you can get at God, and it's like kind of it's a personification of a value system. But so if you take that definition of God, everybody has a value system. Unless maybe if you're schizophrenic or something, maybe you kind of do actually act randomly. But even that, I think, I doubt that. I don't think that that's the case. And uh, yeah, but so essentially everybody has a value hierarchy, and so whatever sits at the top of that value hierarchy is God. And so, from my perspective, then everybody kind of is theistic. But now, I think where people struggle the most with is that they believe God is supposed to be like a supernatural being that intervenes in the world. But I actually think that's true too, and that's the weird part. In
Okay.
but I think that is actually a byproduct of this God that I described. Like I don't have to tack anything else on. Like just believing in this God, because then like you're not actually in control of the choices you make. And like maybe you relate it to this scenario where it's like, okay, tomorrow you make this plan. It's like, okay, I'm gonna be super productive, and I'm gonna do all my homework, and I'm gonna get ahead of my classes, and do great. And then it's like, tomorrow comes, and it's like you sleep in, and then you play video games all day, and you don't do any of that. And so what's going on there? Like, why is that the case? And like what that means is like the part of you that you identify with is not all of you. So there's something about you that's beyond that you're aware of. And so then effectively, there's something that transcends you that's controlling you. And I mean, that's God. But what it is that's guiding you is your values and principles. Now you might not be aware of your values and principles that guide you. But I'm kind of arguing, like this is almost like a philosophical claim, or like maybe even like kind of like a theoretical scientific claim, that given the fact that there's an order to the choices that you make, it's not completely random. Like you're not just shouting random sounds right now and moving your hands around erratically. Like you're doing a ordered pattern set of behaviors. There's some value system that guides you, but you might not be fully aware of your own value system. Like I'm definitely not fully aware of mine. But
Sure.
so it controls you, it guides you, and it makes actions for you beyond what you're aware of.
So I don't know if I. So first of all, I like, at least in principle, I agree with you. I agree that everybody has a value system that they're not fully cognizant of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily agree with the characterization of that as God or even something as mystical. I think a lot of that, at least the way I view things, is I believe that a lot of that is just learned behavior. You're not always cognizant of the way things that you have experienced in this world since you were born
Sure.
have influenced your behavior. So I don't fully buy the fact that that is the work of something beyond us. I think it's part of us, and it's things we've learned just by experiencing society and things like that.
Yeah, to me, those are the same thing. They're the same thing. And
Yeah.
what I would say is, you're not fully aware of that which is guiding your actions. And so, like, okay, I view religion as a phenomenology, right? It's a phenomenon, like the technical term I would say is it's a phenomenological ontology. And so, like, a phenomenology is just, it's a description. It's like, hey, there's these experiences you have, and now I'm going to give a descriptive kind of narrative and name terms of things that happen, and come up with names for these certain experiences and these certain things that happen. And then an ontology is kind of like, like it's the study of like modes of being and like being itself. And so it's kind of like, you have this experience of the fact that as you act through the world, you end up making decisions and engaging in actions that, like, in some sense you wish you didn't do. But then it's like, well, what does that mean? How do you do something yet you don't want to do? Right? Well, the only way you can is if something beyond what you're consciously aware of is controlling you and is guiding you. And like in some sense, what I would say is, like, it's irrelevant whether it's, just my history or whether it is divine intervention or supernatural. Like, they're all the same thing to me, because all I'm talking about is a phenomenological description. And so, like, since you're a physicist, you might actually like get this. And I kind of talked about this a bit with my last guest, but it's like we know about quantum mechanics now. But if you go before quantum mechanics was invented, you look at something like thermodynamics, right? Like thermodynamics didn't know what was going on at the atomic level. Like the atom was not a developed concept, right? So then you can talk about like kind of materials, and you can talk about, heat capacities, and you can talk about all these other things, but it's like kind of like an effective theory. And it's, like it doesn't get into the nitty gritty details of what's actually happening on a microscopic level, because it didn't know about that yet. But then with quantum mechanics coming out, and then, things that you and I work on, like kind of the goal is actually to understand and try to like merge quantum mechanics with thermodynamics. But the presence of quantum mechanics doesn't invalidate thermodynamics. It's just a different lens to kind of look at the same thing. And so I view like religion, it's a particular lens to look at experiences and things and phenomena that happen. And so it's And then I get hung up
Sure.
on this word supernatural, because people say like, oh, like nothing's supernatural, but it's like I don't even know what that word actually means, to be honest, because like there's a certain definition of supernatural that like it's like, well, how would you ever know if something's truly supernatural? Because it's kind of like everything I experience is the natural world. Like this is at least a physicist worldview. Everything's natural. So then to be supernatural, but how would you even experience it if it's supernatural, right? So then it's kind of like, I don't think that was the original intent of the word supernatural. It's like beyond what I can comprehend or something. And
Hmm. It's interesting. I think, I mean, you and I can agree that you can definitively call certain things supernatural. For instance, if like a ghost was to pop up behind you right now,
sure.
that would be supernatural. So we
Why?
do have some
Why?
conception of.
Why would that be supernatural? Because I think another physicist might say, oh, well, the way that I can explain that actually is that, this other thing was happening and it was actually some kind of, chemical reaction going on or whatever, or it was like quantum fluctuation or something. Like people would come up with something because it occurred in the natural world.
But if it did occur, it would no longer be supernatural. That's true.
Sure.
I think supernatural means it's the problem with this is that you can never definitively call something supernatural, like you
That's my
said,
point.
because you would need to know that it can never happen. But like this is the common argument that a lot of it's a very common argument for believing in God is that I think it's the same thing. It's that you're saying that you can't disprove the existence of God, which I don't think is good enough. Just because you can't disprove a certain claim doesn't mean that you have any reason to believe in it.
Right, but I guess to me, okay, like from my perspective, when I hear the word supernatural, I think it's equivalent, like synonymous to the word bullshit. It's like when people use it, that's what's meant. You know what I mean? It's like supernatural is
Sure, sure.
bullshit. I mean, it's like something that's impossible, like can't happen in the natural world, which is all that. But then the natural world is everything around us. So then it's like, in some sense, like like I would completely agree with atheists on this point of like this idea of a supernatural being that is controlling us is kind of, well, okay, actually, no, because I almost kind of do actually believe that God is supernatural. Like, but I believe God is us, and it's like it's the sum total of the entire universe is the divine logos, and it's like, but then it's still contained in the universe. Although something had to start it.
I think, this might be a little bit of a digression, but like what you just said, that God is the sum total of our being,
Mhm.
is actually uh, it's another very central belief in Hinduism, I think. So this is what's called Advaita Hinduism, and Advaita just means non-dualistic. And when you say non-dualistic, it just means that there is no difference between our state of mind and divinity. It's like one and the
Sure,
same.
sure,
It seems like that's. It seems like this is essentially what you're getting at,
sort of,
or something
sort
on
of.
those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, we're like brushing up against the end point of what I've thought about, which is exciting. I that's a good place to be if your goal is to learn, right, and to think. But it's okay. Let me think about this. So I have this mode of being, right? So the fact that you have a value hierarchy, you can symbolize at the top of that value hierarchy. You can, for all intents and purposes, call that a god. When you act in alignment with these principles, I would say, like by definition, you're worshiping that god. And then, okay, then we have God the Creator, and then okay, so this is worshiping this god. And then what I can say is you have some flexibility on the values that generate your actions. And what you can say is what's the greatest good, what's the highest value that I can orient my life around. And then what I would say is if you live by that value hierarchy, what sits at the top is the divine logos, which is kind of like the traditional notion of God. But now, since that's the defined as the greatest good, then God the creator, you could say like, okay, you know, being itself is good, right? And since like within being we can come to form a relationship with the greatest good, and the greatest good emerges out of being. But since it's the greatest good, and since being itself is good, that somehow links, like this is, okay, this is hand wavy, but this somehow links God the creator with this idea of this emergent good. And maybe you could say God the creator has to be supernatural. But then it's like, I mean, how does, like,
I have a couple of criticisms of
yeah, let's
like
hear
this
it, let's hear
chain of
it. Sure.
logic.
Mm-hmm.
The first one to me is like they're essentially the same, but it seems like this is very axiomatic, and it
Okay.
almost sounds like a post-rationalization of your lived experience. Like
So is everything, though. Okay,
when
maybe not
when
everything, but okay, go on, go on. Yeah.
when you're making an ontological claim,
Uh-huh.
like I need to be like I feel like I need to be convinced of why this value system you adhere to um, is worthy of being like defined as God, for instance. Like why is it just not the sum total of my actions, and like why is there even an element of worship? And like uh,
Yeah, so
yeah, like it's not obvious to me. Like even if you want to define value system that you adhere to as God,
mhm.
my question is why?
Well, I would say it's a god because like you're placing it at a personal level. It's like a personal god. It's not like, you know, let's say like the Abrahamic version of God. That's like what I would say is the divine God. But what I'm saying is like if like you have a value hierarchy that orients you. At the top of that is a highest value. And what I would say is the personification of that highest value for all intents and purposes is your God. And everybody
Sure.
has one. And when you act in alignment with these principles, I'm defining worship as that. That is you worshiping this God. That's almost by
Then you're always
definition.
worshiping, right?
No,
Like
he's worshiping a particular God.
okay,
Right. But then, you know, like, you might not act perfectly in alignment with the divine logos. You know, like, at most, there's been one human on all of human history that has. And that would be Jesus Christ, you know, at most, you know, and that's if you buy the Christian worldview. But, like, I think, okay, would you agree that there's, what are, like, do you believe in the idea of good and bad?
hmm.
Was Nazism bad? Let's say, right? Like that's the most extreme
Sure.
example, but sure. So and then so okay, like I think bad is a lot easier to grab onto and say like okay, that clearly exists, right? Like we could say something that induces suffering, unnecessary suffering in the world, right? Like that's, you know, like malevolence is bad. And so what that means though is like if you engage in malevolence, that means whatever god you're worshiping is a bad one because like the value system that is generating the actions that cause you to be malevolent. It's something like we ought not do that, right? And so there is this idea of we should try to be better than we are and try to improve ourselves and try to become better and better people, right? And I feel like everybody has this, you know, like I think everybody has
Agreed.
some notion of here's where I am, here's where I'd like to be, and I'd like to be better. And if you do something that you think is wrong, like maybe you know, cheat on an exam or on homework, or you cheat on your partner, or you know, you steal something, like there's something in you that tells you you should not do this, right? And so you like internally, you know, like there's something telling you what is good and what is bad. And it's kind of like, you know, like what happens if you listen to that voice all the time and you do what it says? Then it's something like that is the divinity in you, and that will align you with the divine logos. Like this is a bit hand wavy, but I don't know if you have a comment for that.
Like I guess I'm with you until you get to the divine logos part. Like I don't understand why we need to postulate this eh, like at least in like what we in everyday parlance call supernatural entity, because it seems like the
Okay,
rest of
for now
everything you've
let's scrap
described is independent
supernatural.
of that.
Yeah, for now let's scrap supernatural. Uh, okay. Would you say you understand my conception of a god?
I think so.
And
I
then
think they're go on.
And then so it's kind of, you have a value hierarchy that generates your actions, but you can swap out these value hierarchies and you can ask what's the best value hierarchy that will achieve the greatest good. I'm defining that as the divine logos, or like the divine God. Like, as you have, for every value hierarchy, sitting at the top of that is a highest value. There's, a near infinite number of value systems that you could be acting out. And for each one, whatever sits at the top is a god, like in my framework here. But then you can have a better or worse framework, and then the best one. So the one that yields the greatest good, I'm defining that as the divine logos, or let's say the divine God in this framework. And so, are you on board with that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to get to the root of your conception of this notion of divinity. It seems like for you, the existence of this ultimate good or like state of being that generates the most amount of good for all of us,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in some sense divine. That is, it's like
That's my definition. Yeah.
right. But for you to call it divine, I suppose you must believe that it's like beyond something that's just the result of human behavior or something like that.
Potentially, yeah. And so this is actually why I struggle with the story of Jesus. And yeah, like, I'll deny it if you ever see me at church or something, but no, I'm kidding. No, like, I mean, like, that's one of the things that is literally unbelievable about the story of Jesus, is that in some sense it's like he achieved this acting out the divine logos, and it's kind of like, well, that's almost like, okay, have you taken real analysis? Okay, so there's this idea of what you can have. Two number systems are dense. Like, you can have, like, the rationals are dense and the reals. All right, so for the viewers, oh, man, this is a hard one. So you have the real number line, and then you have the rational numbers, which are just the numbers made up of ratios, like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 3/7, something like this. And then, you can ask, is that all the numbers? Like, is every real number between 0 and 1 of the form of a ratio? And, kind of, it turns out the answer is no. But then there's this property that, if I take a sequence of rational numbers, so I can say, like, 1/1, and then 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. And I ask, if I keep doing this sequence until infinity, there's a what's called a limit, and there's this tends towards a number. So in that case, that sequence tends to 0. And so there's this property, though, that you can, every irrational number, which is numbers that can't be written as a ratio, can be written as a sequence, the limit of a sequence of rational numbers. And that is to say that the rationals are dense in the reals. And, okay, so, like, my conception, and Jesus really kind of, like, throws a wrench in this idea. So, like, I'm struggling to piece together, how much of a quote-unquote Christian I am, whether I fully believe this. But it's something like, okay, what we can certainly say is that we can be progressing towards the divine logos. And so what I want to say, like, there's an example of this idea in science. I would say, if you look at Newton's laws, right? Newton posited a worldview about, mechanics, and about, like, what happens when we throw rocks and such, and gravity and some of these other things. And, like, it was a model of the natural world. But then, at some point, we started to do experiments that invalidated this, and it wasn't actually describing everything. Then Einstein came around and came up with a new model. And now what I would say is Einstein's model is more true than Newton's model, because everything that Newton's laws can explain is contained within general relativity. But general relativity can explain more things, right? And so then, like, that's like a sequence. You could have a sequence of models, and the infinite limit of this sequence of models is the natural world itself. But no model of the natural world is the natural world, but the sequence of models of the natural world converges to the natural world itself. And what I would say is, in the same sense, you can talk about, like, a moral set of virtuals, or of values, right? And you have better and better modes of being, better and better articulation of the principles of how to act. And like, okay, Nazism is bad, right? It's like, okay, maybe we start there, and then we could improve upon that. And then I would say our current system and the values that, like, take the typical person in America, let's say, are better than that. And so then you have like a direction, and it's like we're progressing towards something. And it's like the limit, as t goes to infinity, of us trying to articulate what's better and better is God itself. It's the divine logos, right? But it's like you can get glimpses of it, and you can get like something telling you, like, I don't know, like occasionally you're just gonna have these overwhelming experiences where it's just like, I know this is what I need to do right now. And it's like, I don't know how to describe it except for, like there's something beyond what I can explain about that. And yeah, does this make any sense? Are you following that?
Yeah, I think I understand where we disagree now.
Okay.
I think what's difficult for me is even just the postulate that there is some ultimate state of being. Because the the way I see it, I actually don't think there is like an objective morality. Like like Nazism is bad, sure, but it's bad because we agree it's bad because we feel things like pain and suffering and empathy, and those are conditioned behaviors that are the result of living together as a society. And so I think our morality is really what society agrees is going to let it flourish for the most part. Like it's
Mhm.
bad if we just all started killing each other today because that would impede progress of society, and that's not to me that's not something that you need to appeal to divinity for. It's like almost self-evident for us to coexist together.
Okay, but then, like, sort of, but then, like, we're not just trying to coexist, we're also trying to thrive, right?
Sure.
But what does that mean? What does that actually mean to thrive? And
That's
it's,
a good question.
yeah, it's not mutually agreed upon, right? And then maybe my belief in thriving actually negatively impacts you. So then what do we do? And like, okay, like I went down this objective morality, and okay, do you believe in objective reality?
Uh, like what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so okay, so objective morality, it's kind of like there's no generalized set of principles that can dictate in some objective sense, independent of individuals and individuals' subjective experience, what is good and what is bad. There's no generalized set of principles. So in the same sense, like, is there a generalized set of principles that describes the natural world?
I mean, we're physicists, right? Like,
No, sure. But do you believe that that exists? Okay, and then,
um,
okay, what's different?
I think what's different is consciousness.
Sure.
This is the problem. It's because we don't know a damn thing about consciousness, really.
Yeah, I agree, man. I agree. Like, and I,
Yeah.
I agree. Like, that's almost like the missing link fundamentally. But I like what I would say in some sense is this idea of consciousness is outside the realm of science. But what I would say is something like this, right? Like, there are patterns to modes of being, and so it's like these ancient stories tell you if you act this way, this will happen, and it doesn't always articulate that explicitly. Like, it'll tell you a story. And so I got a video coming out soon actually talking about how science is actually, in part acting out the story of Lucifer.
Okay.
And then I make a recommendation on how we, correct that. But it's kind of like there's these biblical stories say if you act a certain way, there's like this pattern to being itself. And it's like, we've done the experiment, and we've, had billions of humans out, and humans that tend to act this way, this happens. And then you can articulate that into a pattern. And then it's like, just like, so like, in some sense, what I would say is, okay, we have models of the natural world, but then you can have models of modes of being. And I would say the definition of a model of modes of being actually is a story. That's what a story, that's how I define what a story is. It's a model for a mode of being. But then here's the thing is you could say, okay, modes of being are random. It's like there's no link between your actions and what's guiding and what's driving your choices and the outcome. And if you believe that, then fair enough. But if you don't believe that, and you believe there actually is a pattern to modes of being, and if I embody and act out a certain set of principles, that like there's actually a predicted outcome of what's going to happen of that, like to me, that's asserting actually that there is objective morality.
Interesting. Okay. I almost believe this, but to me the problem with this is that these patterns seem so dependent on socialization, and I think socialization eventually
Sure.
comes from your environment. So, for instance, like different societies evolved in different parts of the world lead to different collective behaviors, and I think this modeling human behavior approach kind of breaks down in a sense because if you took the same group of people and subjected them to the same stimuli, um, they wouldn't respond the same way as a different group of people would.
Sure.
In that sense, it's not. I don't think it's science in the sense that, like, yes, there are these
No, I
stories that
agree.
told you how people in like how many ever millions of years ago behaved when they were subjected to these stimuli. And our society today shares some elements with that, and we respond to those stimuli the same way in the context of those elements that we share with them.
Yeah, and then this is okay. This is where this again, like pushing on the edge of what I've articulated and thought about. But like what I would say is kind of then the resolution is not to look at specific stimuli, but it's relations between the person and the stimuli. It's like okay, like do you know anything about psychology?
Really, no.
Okay, yeah. So like a common thing, like you might hear this, it's almost a meme that everyone's like, oh, like tell me about your childhood, and it's kind of like there's certain patterns that like people are like kind of okay, if you've experienced some kind of abuse as a in your childhood, it's going to lead to this kind of let's say personality type, but there's not an exact link, but there's like a clustering. There's like it's more people that tend to have this personality type came from this upbringing, but this upbringing does not always lead to that. Like it's kind of like I think it's only something like 30% of people that experience child abuse actually turn into some form of personality disorder. I mean, 70% of people don't, right? So it's like, well, then it's like what you're looking at is not the causal factor. Like it's not just abuse. So it's like hard to say if
Right.
I
I see what you're
insert a
saying. Yeah.
particular stimuli here, like because then it's kind of like like I'm trying to think of an example in physics, but nothing's coming to mind. But it's kind of like, well, then it's and like this is one of the nice things about physics, and other physicists get offended sometimes when I say this, but physics is the simplest subject, right? I mean, it's like we're studying a single atom, right? Or like maybe a collection of atoms in a symmetrically oriented way.
Mhm.
But it's like, a human is a completely disordered collection of trillions of atoms. And then if we want to talk about society, I put millions of them together interacting in ways that we can't articulate. And so then it's really hard actually to make a causal link between stimuli and output.
Yeah.
But then there are patterns to it, though. And it's kind of like, there's a pattern to particular types of leaders can unify people together. But then it's like, okay, like to me, whatever the pattern is about modes of being and acting out certain ways, that's a religious framework. And it's a model, is what I would say. Like it's a model about modes of being. And it's a model about like kind of your conscious experience in some sense. Let's say that. Like you as a conscious agent, here's a framework and a model that if you act out these set of principles and you act in alignment with this is what will happen to you. In the same way that it's like, if you have a electron gun and I'm shooting it at two slits and there's a screen behind it, here's what's going to happen, and then we have a model to describe that. And so it took me a long time to get to this point, and I don't think this is the kind of thing that I can convince people in one conversation.
Of course.
I'd love to learn how to, though, but like maybe this is starting to like at least sound maybe kind of plausible what I'm saying.
Definitely plausible. In fact, I think to me, it seems like this really comes down to your model of consciousness. Really, like it
Sure.
seems like, do we believe that our conscious experience is in some sense predictated by like the motion of electrons and atoms in our brain and all this stuff? Because in that sense, then the patterns that we exhibit are scientific. You can make a testable claim about that. Uh, and even if it's like really complicated emergent behavior, it's a causal link. If consciousness, in fact, in fact, random in some sense, or at least like partially random, then it seems like that claim breaks down. So,
Sort of, except no, I agree. Like it's almost like, do you have free will? And then
yeah,
I remember one time, a few years ago. It was actually like I hadn't smoked weed in a while, and I smoked weed this one time, and then I thought about how free will is actually equivalent to there is a God. Uh, and it's kind of like, well, free will is almost something supernatural because it would violate determinism in some sense, And then maybe quantum
I
mechanics
believe.
you can sneak in because quantum mechanics isn't deterministic, even though the theory is deterministic, but then measurements like violate that. I mean, it's a bit of a mess, but if you just believe the laws of physics are deterministic, then if you had free will, like that almost violates that. But then the laws of physics describe the natural world, so it'd have to be something supernatural. Uh,
Yeah, so this I'm completely on board with. Is
mhm.
like if in fact we could somehow show that free will is real, uh, I would become extremely religious because
I don't know how
I
you
don't
could.
know.
Yeah, I don't know how you could.
Yeah,
No, and I
yeah.
agree with you. And this was a pivotal part of my journey to get to where I am. And as I started, I didn't believe in objective morality. That made me actually question objective reality. And then that's a dark place. I don't recommend that because you don't know, nothing's true, and it's kind of like it's hard to make progress in anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I started thinking about free will and do we have it? And for a while, especially the physicist in me is like, no, like I mean, like kind of the whole point of what we study is trying to
It
predict
breaks
emergent
down our
phenomena.
entire worldview. Yeah.
Oh, I know, sure, exactly, right. And so, no, I agree. And so it's tricky. Okay, but then here's one other thing. So with the current laws of quantum mechanics, right? Like, if you were to just throw on a computer and just brute force something, I think it's like 260 atoms, it would take longer than the age of the universe to run.
Okay.
And so, like, there's like also this effective problem that it's kind of like, okay, maybe you could in principle develop a machine, and if it if it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to take all the initial conditions of you, but then you can somehow prove that the time it would take to actually run this is longer than like your own life, then you know you can almost prove that you can't actually do this. And so this
Non-quantum
is
mechanical.
this
Yeah.
is tricky because like there's actually this idea with quantum computing is there's certain problems that do this, and like one of the big ideas is kind of like there's this thing called complexity theory in computer science, and we have these class of difficulty of problems, and then there's these class of problems called NP complete, and it's kind of like it's this massive class of problems, and if you could solve any one of them, you could solve all of them. But then there's no way to solve them in polynomial time, which for people that have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, it's quick. Let's say it's like to solve it, it doesn't blow up exponentially in time as things get a bit more complicated, and so you can solve it efficiently. But then people are kind of like, oh, quantum computing, this is great. We can like kind of maybe this will actually allow us to bypass this NP complete problem. And then it turns out like if you take an NP complete problem and you map it onto a quantum system, and this was before like quantum computing, this is the idea of quantum annealing. It turned out that like there's a so the adiabatic theorem, but like in order to cool it
Infinite amount
slow
of time.
enough,
Right.
yeah, in order to cool it slow enough to actually achieve the solution to the problem, it turned out that you need infinite time if the problem was NP complete. So then it's kind of like, okay, maybe there's a class of problems that are so complex that they're effectively impossible, even if not literally. And maybe a machine that actually determines your actions is in that class. I have no idea. I don't even know how I would go about trying to
Yeah.
show that that's in the set
Like
of
at the
complex, complexity NP complete, but
yeah. definitely at the fringes of our knowledge, because even if we could prove that like consciousness like isn't like if you just built a network of like a billion atoms and like made it some sort of quantum computer, even if that couldn't emulate consciousness, you would have to like rule out every possible
No, sure. Yeah.
physical mechanism for
I know, yes,
consciousness to
yeah.
exist.
Sure.
So,
But then, like, these computer science guys are really clever, so I don't know if, like, I'll actually talk to my friend about this one. Like, he talks to a lot of these he studies complexity theory and see if he can
right.
get somebody excited enough to try to ask, like, is the idea of determining your outcomes in the class of NP-complete problems? You know? Like, starting from some initial conditions, actually determining the output of a human being's choices. But then I think also the choice matters. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. Like, maybe someone's already kind of thought about this, but like at least in theory, I can imagine that problem's NP complete. So then what do you say? If it's NP complete, and in principle then means that you don't have a general system that actually can tell you that for any person that can be solved in efficient time, it's almost like effectively saying free will exists, because there's no way that I can actually, in a general sense, determine an arbitrary human's outcomes.
Hmm, I don't know.
Yeah, I
I don't
mean
know if that's true.
this is a less rigorous argument, right?
Yeah.
Because like now we're getting into like almost like a pragmatic definition of
Verifying consciousness is probably not even like NP at all. Like you can't, you might not even be able
might be
to verify
undecidable.
your,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, sure.
you might not be able to
Sure.
verify your solution in polynomial time. So it's, yeah,
Yeah, no, sure. Well, I guess you could, right? Like if at least if you talk about free will, because then it's like, okay, I set up my computer and then I make a prediction, like, okay, here's your outcome, and then I just had the person make a choice
and then see if it
and
makes
then
the same outcome.
see if it
Okay.
agrees. Yeah, I think the
Yeah.
verification's easy.
Fair
But
enough.
that at
Yeah.
least smells like NP, like.
Yeah.
But maybe there is an efficient way to do it. Who knows? But maybe there's not. I don't know. I mean, basically everything about quantum systems is in NP something, whether it's NP hard or NP complete or whatever. Almost everything that has to do with things that you need, all the energies in a quantum system, to actually solve Schrodinger's equation, let's say, is NP something. Uh, so anyway, I mean, like
Honestly,
this is kind of like a
yeah.
pragmatic approach to this, and yeah, but anyway, yeah.
Even like just philosophically, I don't know if I believe that free will is like this magical result of bizarre quantum interactions. It seems too fortuitous to believe. I don't know.
It's too what?
And it seems like it seems too lucky to be true. What I mean, like if you somehow have, because just having randomness from quantum mechanics isn't enough to give you free will, right?
Here's the
To
tricky
be
part: is quantum mechanics is actually a deterministic theory. Like this is something I don't know if everybody knows this. Like the theory itself, like Schrodinger's equation, is what's called a deterministic equation. But then the measurement itself is what introduces a probability distribution. It makes it probabilistic. Which I mean, like definitely, let's say more spiritually minded people like have a heyday with that fact. But yeah, so it's not obvious to me that maybe the laws of physics, like the laws of physics, actually are deterministic. But then to observe it isn't. Like somehow when you actually engage in the aspect of observation or measurement, I'm not sure that those two are the same thing. Maybe they are. That somehow is where the probabilistic nature comes into play. But then, you'd want to do a measurement to see if free will is a thing or not, right? So, I don't know. And I know
the
Freeman Dyson, he's a Nobel laureate. I think he was the academic father, what do you call it? The PhD advisor of Richard Feynman, I think. He's definitely related to Richard Feynman somehow. And
they worked on QED together.
right, sure, right, and so like especially later in his life, people like would talk to him about his interpretation of quantum mechanics, and he interprets it as like even the electron has choice in some sense, and so like it's how to interpret quantum mechanics is absolutely not fully understood, and physicists have given up asking. which I think's a bit of a shame. But in any case, yeah, I think we might be deviating a bit far. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this too,
Yeah.
but
Uh, yeah, I mean, in that sense, I think that's kind of where my spirituality or religiosity comes from. It's from this lack of understanding of, let's say, happens when you measure a quantum system. Why does it collapse? It makes no sense to me, and no one has given me a satisfactory answer. So, what I don't understand, I relegate to the realm of spirituality, I guess.
okay, so I have a couple things. I was like pretty obsessed with this question for a while, and I was thinking about making a research project. Is I don't think you can measure something without interacting with it. So in some sense, if you ignore the interaction with the outside world, with whatever the measurement device is, maybe that's what introduces the probability distribution. But if you include it in your system, the thing that measures, then maybe you could actually
Yeah.
preserve determinism. And then it's only when you ignore that part, and you like, like in the like scientific term, you like trace over that, I mean, like trace over that subsystem.
Trace over the environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what introduces the probability, and like that happens in material systems. That's how we have, like the concept of temperature is this, which
Right. Yeah.
introduces a
I've heard
probability
this.
distribution. And
I've heard
uh,
this argument, like everything's a pure state, and it's because we're tracing out some part of it, it becomes a mixed state, and that's where your probability comes from.
yeah, it could be
It's
right, could be, and then maybe that's why
convincing,
it's
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I haven't seen a rigorous proof that it's like what I would love to see, and I thought about doing this as a research project, and then just kind of got overwhelmed with like let's say other research projects. I was going to say real research projects, which might not be a bad word, but let's say other ones. And I was thinking like maybe you could do this for simple systems, but we could talk about that, in our next research meeting. But
Sure.
but then so that's one thing is maybe it actually is completely deterministic, and you don't have this probability distribution, which would actually kind of like totally poke a hole in my whole, you know, like if everything is deterministic, that
Yeah.
like to me that still actually does not invalidate my conception of religion. But then there's one other thing that's interesting, and so this is definitely getting more on the woo side of uh of quantum physics. But one thing that you can say is like the scientific method, the whole goal, right, the desire of it is to say there is a natural world out there that's separate from me as the subject. There's the objective world, and then there's the subject who views the objective world. And then the fantasy, or like the goal of science, to remove the subject and try to get at the objective world. And one interpretation of quantum mechanics is actually saying, can't do that. Like, you as a subject are intimately linked with the objective world, and your presence modifies it. And so they're like, in some sense, it's almost like there is no objective world without the subject. And this, like that's like that's a complicated idea. Like I think physics almost assumes that's not the case, and that, like it almost could be like in math, it's like assume a set of principles. If you lead to a contradiction, one of your principles is wrong, and maybe the principle that you can actually separate the subject and object is actually wrong. Quantum mechanics is kind of saying that because we have to, in an ad hoc way, inject in the subject who does the
Yeah.
measurement to observe it, to collapse the wave function and give you an actual thing that you measure. But then one way to interpret that is that the subject is actually, like, you can't separate the objective world from the subject. And definitely a lot of spiritual people have a heyday with that and say that that implies God or something like this. And I haven't fully drawn the connection yet, so I'm not going to speak too much to that.
Yeah.
Maybe there is
I mean,
something there.
it seems like even like any research project on like a small system would, if you could actually show this, it seems like it's the same thing, right? Like if you are part of the pure state in some sense of the whole system, then it makes sense. So
Yeah, I did like a small, like back of the envelope calculation, and I didn't get, like, it didn't match the idea of wave function collapse. But I did not do this in a general sense. I mean, took a very simplified model. So like maybe in a general sense you actually can prove this, or if you take a bit more of a complicated approach to things. But you kind of want in this procedure where you include the measurement that, you know, if you do that and then you actually incorporate the effect of the measurement into your system, then the output, that like the prediction it makes, is the same thing as the prediction made by the whole wave function collapse idea. And then if it is, then that would in some sense say that, okay, actually the laws of nature are completely deterministic. There's not this random element to it. And the only reason it is probabilistic is because we're not including the full scope of what's going on with the
Complete
system.
modeling, yeah.
Yeah, and in some sense, when you try to measure something, you can't do it in a way that doesn't disturb it. Which I think that's even also a pretty interesting idea. But, yeah. Yeah, so I guess at this point, you know, we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. Yeah, I guess, is there any other questions that you might have? Like, do you feel, is there, like, with pertaining to the question of, like, let's say, my religious view, is there still any, like, let's say, questions or skepticisms that are at least easily articulated that, like, you know, hey, like, this part I'm, you know, really skeptical with? Or is it?
No,
Yeah,
I think it's an interesting way of like trying to understand religion. I think it's actually it's a very productive cause to try and get to the bottom of what religion is saying. Even if I don't believe like your ontological claims, I believe some of them. I don't know if I buy into the notion of like, this ultimate value system being separate from us in some sense. I think that may be where we diverge. And it seems like that also comes down to this whole question of free will and things that are,
sure.
at least for now, inherently unanswerable.
Sure.
Um,
Okay, just real quick, when you say separate from us, what do you mean by that? Like to make it supernatural?
Supernatural or divine, or some sense that there is this limit that we are tending towards. All, yes, is something that hasn't fully crystallized to me. Uh, Ultimately, I think it's a very worthwhile cause to try and get to what religion is saying at its essence.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's kind of
yeah,
what drives
yeah,
me. And like the assumption I try to take initially is, instead of saying essentially, you know, like I kind of feel like Richard Dawkins kind of says this. Is basically like his presupposition is this is a bunch of horseshit. Like it's, you know, like this old archaic way of being, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better. And the attitude I try to take is maybe there's something to this, that if we do that, will be potentially even tragic, because there's something to this that's not nothing. You know? And if, like, even alone, if you just say, why have these religions lasted as long as they have? They've gone through billions of people over thousands of years. Like that alone is a unbelievable phenomenon. It's like, how do you explain that? You know, like maybe there's something to this, and that's kind of the approach I try to take. But yeah, I think at this point, you know, I'm starting to get a bit fatigued. I think this was actually like a really interesting conversation, and hopefully, you know, the viewers think so as well. You know,
think
so
so.
definitely to the viewers, make sure you like and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay up to date. And then, you know, to you, Varun, it'd be good if you want to, you know, at some point we can chat again. And then to the viewers,
Sure,
if
yeah, this was a lot of fun. Yeah,
yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I think it, you know, really picked up steam, especially somewhere towards the end when we started getting into quantum mechanics. Hopefully, we didn't get too obtuse for everyone, and they enjoyed it. But yeah, I guess for now, until next time, take care, everyone.